Somewhere in the Zagros Mountains of central Iran, buried under more than 300 feet of solid granite, there's a facility the world barely knew existed 3 years ago. Iran calls the mountain Ku-e-Kolangaz La. The West calls it Pickaxe Mountain. And right now, the President of the United States is telling reporters on camera that it's about to get hit very heavily. Not eventually, not someday, soon. So today I want to walk you through exactly what this place is, why it survived the biggest bunker buster strike in American history completely untouched, and why experts are genuinely split on whether the US even has a weapon capable of finishing the job. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand this facility better than most people, covering it on cable news right now. Let's start with where this thing actually is, because location tells you almost everything about why it's such a problem. According to the Institute for Science and International Security, Pickaxe Mountain sits about 15 kilometers south of Iran's Natanz nuclear complex in Isfahan province. The mountain itself rises to roughly 1,006 to 8 meters above sea level, and the facility buried inside it is estimated to sit about 100 meters, that's roughly 328 feet beneath the surface. For comparison, that's deeper than Iran's Fordo enrichment site, which was already considered one of the hardest targets on the planet before last year. So right away, before we even talk about what's inside it, understand this is a facility that was engineered from day one to survive exactly the kind of attack that's now being threatened against it. Construction on this site began back in 2020, according to reporting that traces Iran's own public statements at the time. Iran said the underground facility was being built to replace a centrifuge assembly plant at Natanz that had been destroyed in an earlier incident, with capacity to assemble around 6,000 nuclear centrifuges a year. So from the very start, this wasn't a defensive bunker. It was described by Iran's own government as a production facility, built deep enough into a mountain that outside observers wouldn't be able to confirm what was actually happening inside it. Now here's where the story gets genuinely tense, because this facility has already survived the single biggest American strike operation against Iran's nuclear program in history, and it did that by simply not being on the target list. In June of 2025, U.S. forces carried out Operation Midnight Hammer, striking Iran's 3 primary nuclear sites, Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flew from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and dropped 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, 30,000-pound bunker busters, the largest conventional weapon in the American arsenal, on those 3 locations. Pickaxe Mountain wasn't touched, and according to reporting that's tracked satellite imagery of the site since then, construction didn't slow down after that strike. It accelerated. Trucks kept moving. Tunnel entrances kept expanding. The one facility that survived the biggest bombing run of the entire nuclear campaign is the one that's now getting the most attention. If you're finding this as informative as I think you will, stick around, because the next part of this story is where the real tension is, the question of whether America actually has a bomb that can reach this thing at all. Let's talk about what's allegedly sitting inside that mountain right now, because this is what's driving the urgency. The Wall Street Journal reported that Israeli intelligence assessed Iran transferred nuclear centrifuges into Pickaxe Mountain last fall, machines that are used to enrich uranium, the core process required to build a nuclear weapon. On July 21st, Israeli intelligence officials went a step further, assessing that Iran may have moved some of its enriched uranium stockpile there as well, according to reporting picked up by Israel Hayom and cross-referenced in Wikipedia's live tracking of the situation. And this isn't a small stockpile we're talking about. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran had roughly 441 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% as of June 2025. Enough material, if enriched further to weapons-grade levels, for multiple nuclear weapons. IAEA. Director General Rafael Grossi has said publicly that roughly 200 kilograms of that stockpile is believed to be stored in deep tunnels at a complex outside Isfahan, with additional quantities believed to be at Natanz, where Iran has built this new fortified facility specifically to go deeper than anything that came before it. Now, President Trump has been careful, and I mean genuinely careful, about how he talks about the confirmation level on all of this. When asked directly whether he believes Iran moved centrifuges into the mountain, he told reporters those reports haven't been confirmed, and added that even if true, it doesn't mean anything, unless Iran also has access to enriched material, because centrifuges without material to enrich are just expensive machinery sitting in a tunnel. That's a notably measured answer from a president who, in the same set of remarks, promised to hit the site very, very powerfully. So even the man threatening the strike is publicly acknowledging the intelligence picture isn't fully locked down yet, and that's worth sitting with for a second. Because it tells you this isn't a slam dunk target. It's a judgment call being made under uncertainty, which is exactly the kind of situation that makes wars unpredictable. Quick gut check before we go further. because I want you actually processing this instead of just letting it wash over you. If a facility this hardened, holding potentially both centrifuges and enriched uranium, sits basically undamaged after the largest bunker buster strike in American history, what does that tell you about how this next phase of the war is going to look? Keep that question in your head, because we're coming back to it. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you, because it's the part almost nobody talking about this story is willing to say clearly. Weapons experts are not confident the United States currently has a bomb that can physically destroy this facility. According to Wikipedia's sourced summary of expert commentary on the site, analysts have specifically questioned whether even the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the same 30,000-pound bomb that hit Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan last year, can reach a target built this deep beneath granite rock. Granite matters here specifically because it's dramatically harder and denser than the reinforced concrete and layered rock these penetrator weapons are typically rated against. Axios reported directly that it is not clear whether the U.S. military has bombs that can penetrate the site at all. That's not a rumor from an anonymous forum. That's a mainstream outlet reporting, in plain language, that the fundamental physics of this strike is an open question at the highest levels of the U.S. government, and that uncertainty isn't just coming from outside analysts second-guessing the Pentagon from a distance. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was directly asked about the facility at a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing, and when pressed on it, according to reporting from The Hill, he didn't offer a confident, simple answer either. When your own defense secretary gets cautious in front of Congress about a specific target, that tells you something the press conference bravado from the Oval Office doesn't fully capture. So let's talk about depth for a second, because this is genuinely one of the more fascinating engineering problems in this entire war. A bunker buster like the GBU-57 doesn't destroy a target by exploding on impact at the surface. It works by using its weight and velocity to physically punch through layer after layer of rock and concrete before detonating once it's deep enough to collapse the structure underneath it. Every additional meter of solid rock above a target reduces how much penetration capability the weapon has left when it finally reaches detonation depth. Reinforced concrete is a known, well-modeled material. Granite, especially unpredictable natural granite formations inside a mountain that Iran chose specifically because of that geology, is a much harder problem to model with precision. And that's before you even account for the possibility that Iran deliberately reinforced the tunnel entrances, which satellite imagery analysis has specifically flagged as an ongoing effort at this site. This is exactly why non-proliferation expert Andrea Stricker, deputy director of the Non-Proliferation Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, said in a policy briefing that before the United States and Israel can consider ending major combat operations against Iran, they have two urgent unfinished tasks. First, in her words, they must neutralize Pickaxe Mountain. Second, they need to recover or eliminate Iran's remaining highly enriched uranium stockpiles before those materials can fall into the hands of surviving regime elements or outside actors. That's a direct quote from a non-proliferation expert whose entire career is built around tracking exactly this kind of threat. And it tells you this isn't just political theater from the White House. Serious analysts genuinely believe this site represents unfinished business from a war that many people outside the region assumed was mostly over. Let's get specific about the actual weapon in question for a second, because I think a lot of coverage throws around the term bunker buster without explaining what that actually means mechanically. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator is 30,000 pounds, roughly the weight of an adult blue whale, and it's built almost entirely as a hardened steel casing wrapped around a comparatively small explosive payload. The vast majority of its weight isn't explosive at all, it's raw mass and structural steel, because the entire design philosophy behind this weapon is kinetic penetration, not blast radius. It's dropped from extremely high altitude by a B-2 Spirit, and gravity alone accelerates it to speeds fast enough that the steel casing can physically punch through dozens of meters of reinforced concrete before the fuse triggers detonation at depth. That's a completely different engineering problem than a conventional bomb exploding on contact with a surface target. Against concrete, engineers can model penetration depth with a fairly high degree of confidence because concrete's density and structural properties are well understood and consistent. Granite is a different animal entirely. It's harder than most concrete formulations, but its density and fracture behavior can vary significantly depending on the specific mineral composition of the rock at that exact location, which means predicting exactly how deep a GBU-57 can punch through a specific mountain before losing enough velocity to fail detonation at target depth is a much less precise science. And that uncertainty is exactly what's driving the expert skepticism we just covered. If you're the kind of viewer who actually wants the mechanics explained instead of just the headline outcome, that's exactly why I break stories down this way. And I'd rather lose viewers who want a 30-second hot take than give you an incomplete picture of something this consequential. If you want the honest version of this story instead of the version built for outrage clicks, this is exactly why I dig through primary sourcing instead of just repeating a headline, and I genuinely appreciate you sticking around for the rest of this, because the strategic picture only gets more interesting from here. Let's zoom out to where this fits inside the broader war, because Pickaxe Mountain isn't happening in isolation. According to CENTCOM's own released figures, U.S. and Israeli forces launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran in late February of 2026. And have since struck more than 7,800 targets across the country. After a period where things appeared to calm down, Iran resumed firing on commercial vessels in early July, which pulled the United States back into direct, sustained strikes. As of Trump's most recent comments on the mountain, CENTCOM had completed its 11th consecutive night of strikes, hitting military operations centers, drone storage facilities, and logistics infrastructure across the country, all aimed at degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. So Pickaxe Mountain isn't a standalone decision. It's the next escalation point in a war that's already been running, on and off, for the better part of 5 months, and has already cost the United States more than $37 billion, according to testimony Defense Secretary Hegseth gave to Congress this week. Let's talk about how Iran is responding to all of this rhetoric, because their language has been just as sharp as Trump's. Iran's top joint military command, known as Khatam al-Anbiya, issued a direct warning after Trump's comments, stating that if the United States proceeds with a strike on the mountain, it would be considered, in their words, an explosion of war in the region. I want you to actually sit with that phrase for a second, because up to this point in the conflict, Iran's public rhetoric has mostly framed the ongoing strikes as things they're already at war over. Calling a potential strike on this specific site a fresh explosion of war suggests Iran itself sees this target as categorically different from everything that's already been hit, which lines up with everything we just walked through about how deep, how hardened, and how central to their nuclear ambitions this particular mountain actually is. Now, here's something that adds a genuinely strange layer to all of this, and I think it's important context rather than something to just wave away. Reporting from the Times of Israel notes that Trump has, in the past, told advisors he prefers to keep Iran uncertain about his real intentions by making bold, aggressive threats publicly, even in situations where he doesn't necessarily plan to follow through immediately. That's not me speculating. That's sourced reporting about the president's own stated negotiating approach. So part of what makes this story genuinely hard to predict is that we're watching a public information campaign play out in real time, where even experienced Middle East reporters can't fully separate genuine military planning from deliberate psychological pressure aimed at Tehran. Both things can be true at once. There can be a real strike being planned, and the public messaging can also be intentionally amplified beyond what's operationally certain. And from the outside, you and I don't get to know for certain which parts are which until it actually happens or doesn't. I want to pause here and make sure this lands the way it should, because a lot of coverage of this war either overstates certainty or completely ignores nuance to keep things simple. The honest picture right now is this: Iran built a facility specifically designed to survive the kind of strike that already hit their other nuclear sites. American officials are publicly uncertain whether their most powerful conventional weapon can even reach it. Intelligence about what's actually stored inside remains unconfirmed at the highest levels, including by the president himself. And the political rhetoric on both sides has escalated to the point where Iran is now describing a potential strike, using language typically reserved for a new phase of the war entirely. That's not a simple story, and if any video tells you it is, they're skipping the parts that actually matter. Let's talk about the international oversight angle for a second, because this is a piece of the story that tends to get buried under the military headlines, but it matters just as much for understanding how this ends. According to reporting from ABC News, one non-proliferation analyst cited in that coverage, identified as Davenport, pointed to a real question mark over what types of Iranian centrifuges actually survived last year's strikes, and how many, noting that uncertainty has direct relevance to how quickly Iran could reconstitute its enrichment program, even without Pickaxe Mountain factored in at all. That same reporting underscored what it called the critical necessity of the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, returning to Iran to resume inspections. Because right now, a huge amount of what we're discussing in this video, the centrifuge transfers, the possible uranium relocation, the construction pace, is being pieced together from satellite imagery and intelligence assessments rather than direct, verified inspection on the ground. That's a meaningfully weaker information environment than the world had before this war started, and it's part of why every claim about this site comes with the kind of hedged, uncertain language you've heard me repeat throughout this entire video. Because that hedging isn't me being cautious for no reason. It's an accurate reflection of what the actual experts tracking this are willing to say on the record. And I want to be honest with you about something else here too. because it's easy to lose sight of in a video packed with military terminology and satellite imagery analysis. Every estimate we've covered today, the 441 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, the 200 kilograms believed stored near Isfahan, the centrifuge transfer assessments, all of it comes from a mix of IAEA reporting, satellite imagery interpretation, and intelligence assessments that Israeli and American officials have chosen to make public. None of it is Iran voluntarily disclosing its own program in full. That gap between what's verified through direct inspection and what's being pieced together from the outside is exactly why you're hearing words like assessed and believed throughout this story instead of confirmed. And I think it's important you walk away from this video understanding that distinction rather than treating every number here as an absolute fact. Let's go back to Natanz for a second, because it's worth understanding why this location specifically was chosen by Iran in the first place, beyond just the geology. Natanz has been the symbolic and operational center of Iran's enrichment program for years, the place where the vast majority of its centrifuge cascades have historically operated. Building a hardened backup facility essentially next door, rather than somewhere more remote, tells you Iran wanted proximity to its existing enrichment infrastructure and technical workforce, not just maximum secrecy. That's a trade-off, more accessible for Iran's own engineers, but also a location the rest of the world already had, under close surveillance well before construction on Pickaxe Mountain ever began, which is part of why satellite imagery analysts were able to track construction activity at the site as far back as they have. It's worth remembering how we even got a mountain like this in the first place, because Iran's entire pattern of building hardened, secret enrichment sites isn't new behavior. It's a strategy that goes back years. Fordo itself, the facility that was considered the gold standard of Iranian nuclear hardening before last year's strikes, was originally built inside a mountain near Qom specifically, because Iran anticipated exactly this kind of military threat when it was constructed. Under the 2015 nuclear agreement, Iran had agreed to convert Fordo into a research facility with sharply limited enrichment activity, but that agreement collapsed years before this war ever started. And enrichment at Fordo scaled back up well before Operation Midnight Hammer targeted it directly. Pickaxe Mountain fits that same pattern, but one generation deeper and one generation better protected, built specifically in response to the world already knowing exactly where Fordo and Natanz were. Every time the international community has managed to locate and neutralize one of these hardened sites, Iran's response hasn't been to abandon the strategy, it's been to build the next one deeper. That pattern is exactly what nonproliferation analysts mean when they talk about needing to neutralize Pickaxe Mountain specifically before this war winds down, because leaving this one standing risks becoming the same story one mountain later. Let's also talk briefly about Israel's role in all of this, because a lot of the specific intelligence driving this story isn't coming from American sources at all. The assessment about centrifuges being moved into the mountain traces back to Israeli intelligence shared with Washington, and the more recent assessment about enriched uranium possibly being relocated there as well came directly from Israeli intelligence officials, reported first by Israel Hayom before it spread through international coverage. That matters strategically, because it means any decision about whether and how to strike this facility isn't being made off American satellite imagery alone. It's being shaped by an intelligence-sharing relationship between two governments that have coordinated closely throughout this entire war, going back to the opening days of Operation Epic Fury in February. Whatever happens next at Pickaxe Mountain, it's unlikely to be a unilateral American decision made in isolation. Here's another piece of this that doesn't get enough attention. According to reporting that reviewed satellite imagery from mid-February of 2026, Iran had already been visibly reinforcing tunnel entrances at the mountain, specifically in anticipation of exactly this kind of airstrike threat. At one of the eastern tunnel entrances, analysts observed rock and soil pushed back and leveled directly on top of the tunnel portal, along with a concrete reinforced structure being built over the tunnel opening itself. In plain terms, Iran wasn't just hoping depth alone would protect this facility. They were actively engineering additional protection at the most vulnerable points, the entrances, in the months leading directly up to these public threats from Washington. That tells you Iranian planners saw this exact scenario coming, and they've had real time to prepare for it, not just hope it never arrives. If this kind of deep dive breakdown is useful to you, this is exactly the kind of story where surface-level headlines completely fail to capture what's actually happening. So I genuinely encourage you to keep digging into primary sourcing on stories like this one wherever you get your news, not just here. So let's talk through what actually happens next, because there are really only a small number of realistic paths from here, and I think walking through them honestly is more useful than pretending to know which one is coming. The first path is the one Trump has been publicly describing. A direct strike on the mountain using the largest conventional weapons in the American arsenal, likely GBU-57 penetrators, delivered by B-2 stealth bombers, and the same combination used in Operation Midnight Hammer last year. Given the expert uncertainty we already covered about whether that weapon can actually reach detonation depth through granite at this scale, this path carries real risk of either an incomplete strike that damages the site without destroying what's inside it, or a strike that requires multiple follow-up waves to finish the job, each one adding to the financial and political cost of a war that's already run up a bill north of $37 billion. The second path is continued pressure without an actual strike, essentially Trump's stated preference for keeping Tehran uncertain through repeated public threats, while intelligence gathering continues in the background. This path avoids the risk of an unsuccessful or partial strike, but it also leaves the facility and whatever is stored inside it essentially untouched and potentially still under active construction, which is exactly the scenario nonproliferation experts like Stricker are warning against when they call for the site to be neutralized before this war winds down. The third path, and this is the one that gets discussed the least in mainstream coverage, is that the intelligence picture itself shifts. If future assessments confirm with higher confidence that enriched uranium has actually been moved into the mountain, that changes the calculus entirely. Because at that point, you're no longer debating a facility that could someday support a weapons program, you're debating a facility that may already be storing the specific material needed to build one. That's the difference between a preventive strike and an urgent one, and it's exactly the distinction Trump himself has been drawing when he says the centrifuge reports don't matter without confirmed access to actual material. Now let's bring this back to that question I asked you earlier about what it means that this facility survived the biggest bunker buster campaign in American history completely untouched. Here's my honest read on it, based on everything we've just walked through. I don't think Pickaxe Mountain was skipped last year because it wasn't considered a threat. I think it was skipped because, at the time, American and Israeli planners weren't confident they could actually destroy it, and hitting a target you can't finish just tips your hand to the adversary about what you know and what you're capable of without actually solving the problem. What's changed since then isn't necessarily the weapons available, it's the political calculation. A year of continued construction, new intelligence about centrifuges and possibly enriched material being moved inside, and a war that's already been reignited once this year, all combined to make the political cost of leaving this site alone higher than it was in June of 2025. Whether the military capability to actually finish the job has caught up to that political pressure is the real open question hanging over this entire story right now. I also want to flag something the reporting has been consistent on, which is that analysts genuinely don't believe the U.S. would have left this facility alone last year if it believed the site posed an active, near-term threat at that time. That's an important distinction, because it means the urgency you're hearing in Trump's public comments right now reflects a change in assessment, not a threat that's been sitting there ignored the entire time. Something in the intelligence picture, whether it's the centrifuge transfers, the reinforced tunnel construction, or the enriched uranium assessment from July 21st, has shifted the calculus enough to move this from a monitored site to a stated target in a matter of months. Let's close with the strategic reality, because I think this is genuinely one of the more consequential decisions left in this entire war, more consequential in some ways than the 11 nights of strikes that have already happened, because those strikes have been degrading Iran's conventional military capability, while a strike on Pickaxe Mountain would be aimed directly at the nuclear question that started this entire conflict back in February. If the United States strikes and the weapon works as intended, it removes what experts are calling one of the last unresolved pieces of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. If it strikes and the weapon can't reach detonation depth through that granite, you've now confirmed to the entire world, including every other state with hardened facilities of its own, exactly where the limits of American bunker buster technology sit, which is not a card any military wants to reveal by testing it and coming up short. And if the U.S. never strikes at all, Isfahan province keeps hosting a facility that non-proliferation experts are on record saying must be neutralized before this war can be considered genuinely finished. And I also want to be upfront about one more thing before we get to the close, because it matters for how you should watch this story develop over the coming days and weeks. Threats like this one from a sitting president don't always translate into an immediate, confirmed strike, and they don't always stay just threats either. The honest position, and the one I'm taking with you right now, is that this is genuinely unresolved. Anyone telling you with total confidence exactly when or whether this happens is guessing, dressed up as certainty, and I'd rather tell you plainly that we're watching this unfold in real time alongside everyone else than pretend I have inside knowledge I don't actually have. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I mean this genuinely, not as a rhetorical device to pad out the video. Given what we now know, the depth, the granite, the expert doubt about current bunker buster capability, and the still unconfirmed intelligence on what's actually stored inside. Do you think this strike happens in the next few weeks? Or do you think this becomes another pickaxe-style standoff, threatened repeatedly, but never actually executed? Sit with that question for a second before you scroll to the comments, because your honest gut right on it right now, before any strike happens either way, is worth more than a reaction after the fact. Put your prediction down below anyway, though, because I'll be tracking this closely over the coming days, and I want to come back to this exact video once we know how it actually plays out, and see how many of you called it correctly. Thank you for sticking with a story this detailed all the way through. Stories like this one deserve more than a 60-second headline treatment, and I'd rather give you the complicated, honest version than a clean, simple one that leaves out exactly the parts that actually matter. Stay sharp. Keep questioning what you're being told from every direction on this ongoing war. Weigh the actual source every single time, not just the headline, and I'll bring you the next full update the moment there's something real and confirmed to report, not before. Sources referenced in the script: Institute for Science and International Security, What to Know About Pickaxe Mountain, 2026, Wikipedia, Pickaxe Mountain, retrieved July 2026, CNBC, Pickaxe Mountain, What to Know About Iran Nuclear Facility, Trump May Strike, July 22nd, 2026, ABC News, What is Pickaxe Mountain? Trump says U.S. will hit Iranian nuclear site pretty soon, July 2026. Axios, Trump vows U.S. will soon bomb Iran's Pickaxe Mountain, July 21st, 2026. The Hill, Trump warns of likely strike on Iran's Pickaxe Mountain nuclear facility, July 2026. PBS NewsHour, Trump says U.S. will hit area of Iran's Pickaxe Mountain very heavily, July 21st, 2026. The Times of Israel, Trump claims U.S. will strike Iran's Pickaxe Mountain probably pretty soon, July 21st, 2026. Al Jazeera, what is Iran's Pickaxe Mountain, the mystery site Trump warns he'll attack? July 14th, 2026. Fox News, Iran's hidden mountain nuclear site raises urgent threat, must be neutralized. Reports, 2026. Business recorder at Reuters, Trump says we'll be hitting Iran's Pickaxe Mountain area pretty soon, July 21st, 2026. International Atomic Energy Agency public statements via Director General Rafael Grossi, March 2026.